Hello and welcome to Compliance Culture, the podcast where we explore what it really takes to embed compliance in practice, not just on paper. I'm Lucinda Carney, CEO of Actus, and each episode will be unpacking how organisations can move beyond tick box compliance to build a culture of genuine accountability, trust, and ethical behaviour. We'll be joined by experts and leaders who are making compliance meaningful, from consumer duty and SMCR to training, performance and leadership. So if you're looking to bridge the gap between rules and real-world behaviour, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this week's Compliance Culture, and I'm so pleased to have Paul Whitehouse from PIW Consulting with me today, who's an expert in this space. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself and explain a bit about your background and what you do on this topic?
Sure. Thank you, Lucinda, for the time. Yeah, so I have worked in financial services and the legal profession for over 30 years now, and what I do now is I help firms who need to understand and develop their business culture, to develop regulatory assurance structures, carry out detailed investigations, improve FCA engagement, implement independent whistleblowing processes, that sort of thing. And I worked for Marsh McLennan latterly for about 7 years, and I was at the FCA for 6 years as well, before going it alone.
Okay, so you've got lots of experience of where conduct culture isn't happening, basically, or you've come across it where it's gone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I've see examples where it's gone right, but also particularly those that you focus on, places like the FCA where things haven't gone well.
So, I mean, that's actually quite interesting. But I might come in to see if you've got any horror stories as we go through the podcast episode, which hopefully listeners have gathered. We are talking about conduct culture in terms of where we're going. So, first of all, as you know, I've got a learning and development background, so I've got lots of experience developing background cultural things, but not so much with conduct culture. It's newer to me working with financial services. So could you explain a little bit about what is conduct and culture in the industries that you're referring to, and why is it so important?
Yeah, and I think the good question in terms of, what are they to me? So first of all, conduct, I think of that as actions or inactions, which can be internal or external facing. So in the context of an individual within a firm, it would be the way in which they behave, especially in a particular place or situation. And for a business, it's the manner in which that organisation is being managed or directed. So that's conduct. In terms of culture, it's all really about personality. So, individual, collective, corporate. And I've got I use a definition, which is really a natural definition, really about the shared set of values, beliefs and attitudes that make up an organisation. And I've also heard culture as described as the intersection of people and life. I think that's a good way to put it. And it's just as relevant in terms of, in financial services as well.
The intersection between people and life, that's a new one for me. I like that. Yeah. So it's reality, it's how things really are, isn't it? That's the classic Peter Senge one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of it like a Greek amphitheatre. So, your conduct is everything that's going on in and around the activities that take place there. So competitors, crowd, but also people sharpening swords, so blacksmiths, transport providers. So that's all the conduct stuff. And then the culture is what it looks like from above. So, what projects out of all of those activities. And it's quite challenging to measure because it's an impression that forms really in the mind of the viewer. But, there are ways in which you can get a handle on measuring culture. And I'll perhaps touch on that a little bit later.
Yeah, that would be good, because that's something I know you do training on this, don't you? And actually go in and diagnose culture in organisations, which I guess if you're trying to make a measurable difference of something that's quite hard to, I don't know, nebulous, right? It's quite hard, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
So you have to find ways of measuring something. So it'd be really interesting to understand that.
Yeah.
So I like your Greek amphitheatre. I think that's a particularly appropriate analogy, really, because it could be, well, actually, I think it's where things are going wrong with swords and things going wrong, or, whether you're watching a nice, lovely play or things are going horribly wrong. I think I had a vision of Gladiator going there. But with
Yeah.
so Gladiator's not the culture we're after. But on that note, what sort of culture, if you are in financial services, you also in the legal profession, what culture are we after? What are you looking for that's good, if you like? And equally, if you measured something.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned the word there because, and I think it's really interesting this because, you know, should it be good or should it be professional or collaborative,
Mm.
caring or calm? And a lot of people will say good. I think we've got a good culture, but I get a bit puzzled by it because people, when you ask them the question in financial services, they tend to be a bit obsessed with good, and I think that's because our brains are wired to think that good is right and proper, and then we'll be rewarded or avoid punishment if we're good. But entities, they're not always good. They're not inherently good. They don't have to be. Yeah, there's hundreds of thousands of individual beliefs and attitudes that can mix in a company. And so I would say that if somebody is describing culture, I would try and avoid that that point of sticking with good, if you know what
Yeah,
I mean.
good might vary from one organization to the next, or as good as just a bit of a bland mere word.
Absolutely. I think of it as the sort of vanilla answer.
Yeah,
And I think that corporate entities are quite often they're afraid to acknowledge what they are and what their personality is, and how they conduct themselves, what the culture's like. And when I was working at the FCA, one thing in particular was that I didn't really spend much time worrying about why a firm had a particular culture, but really how it made them act and how they managed themselves according to the risks that their particular culture presented. So what I would do is make it my business really to try and understand their people, the strategy, the customers, how they operated, so you can make really informed judgments and then supervise them effectively. So I would always recommend that leadership and board members, when they're talking about culture, to try and step out of the comfort zone on this one, and and not have that vanilla answer. And there's a number of different ways you can do that, and I've got one or two examples, but it's something that if I was a supervisor going into a firm and asked them about the culture and they said, "Oh, I think it's pretty good," then you sort of start to ask a lot more questions about it to try and unpick what it actually is in there. So it's good, I think, for those senior people to be ready and prepared for this sort of question.
because it is. I'm thinking of when I've done things like competency frameworks or values or something. Is it's defining what good looks like in behavioural terms, isn't it? And and I suppose the difference from me coming from an HR kind of angle is that
Mm,
as an organization that's not fine, that's we're not, if we step away from conduct and culture from a point and we just look at culture, which might be values led in an organization, you've got
mm,
quite a lot of freedom about what the culture could or should be in theory in an organization in terms of values. And you might say, is there a
mm,
culture fit as somebody coming in? So you might be really fast
mm,
moving or entrepreneurial. But I suppose the key thing about regulated companies is that whatever that element of culture, you've still got to have a compliant culture. But
mm,
you've got to meet the requirements of the regulator. So if you're entrepreneurial, that doesn't mean risk taking that's going to be breaking, introducing, financial crime or risk or whatever it is. So it's kind of
yeah.
putting a framework or a controlling what's
Yes.
acceptable in terms of culture.
Yeah.
That's kind of my
Absolutely.
feeling.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes you see that what firms will have quite an aggressive strategy. And sort of we used to, it was almost like the sticky note game where you put the name on your head or what somebody is, and ask them to ask questions about themselves. And we would be able to summarize the culture or what a firm is like within a couple of sentences. You had to be able to do that quickly within the FCA, and you were making judgments based on how they act and react in certain situations. So having an aggressive strategy, no problem. But do you have the right sort of controls in place? Is the compliance structures, as you were referencing there, is that appropriate to be able to manage the risks that they present? And if
So
it is, that's absolutely fine.
So give us an example of that, because I'd love to. So what would be, give us a couple of examples of the sort of labels that you might put on an organization, and therefore, so presumably if you go aggressive, if that was one of the labels, and they're trying to
Mm,
move fast and deep and grow fast and all those sort of things, they need to have stricter. Well, what would they need to have in place? I'm kind of speculating, and I was saying if you could give me an example of that, because I'm speculating that you go right. I'm in the FCA. I label that they've got an aggressive growth culture.
Yeah.
They need to have really rigorous controls and measures in place because
Yeah.
they are incentivizing more risk-taking behavior, let's say, to grow faster, which could
Yes.
introduce the wrong behaviors. I'm theorizing. So they need to have
Yes.
more robust practices and compliance structures in place. I'm theorizing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm guessing. But I guess from your point
Yeah.
of view, what would be the sort of examples of label you might put on a business and their kind of
Yeah.
culture, and what controls would you expect them to have in place that
Yeah.
support?
Yeah, sure. So I think a good one of these, and something that the FSA took a lot of interest in, was around appointed representatives, and something where, or a firm that operates, if you like, a people-light model, but actually outsources a lot of its business. And those sorts of businesses, you expect that their operational controls, the controls in relation to managing the external parties, are going to be really strong around that. So if like the culture of the business may be that they want to operate in this sort of light model, but actually to enable or to utilize other firms to do a lot of the work that they do for them. So appointed representatives is a good example of where you can have one firm that's authorized, but actually sort of 25, 30 firms operating beneath it using its permissions. And
Yeah, I mean that's
in that,
interesting, isn't it? Because that's one of the
yeah,
areas the FCA is trying to tighten up, isn't it? Because I think it could have
absolutely.
perhaps been a little bit more arm's length, having completely separate cultures. Now they need to be a bit more like a branch or part of
Mm,
it. I mean, it's interesting talking to someone who's never worked in financial services. I've just worked with financial services firms. It is interesting from an outsider point of view, thinking about how restrictive this might feel, or how kind of
mm,
if you're a pure private sector organization, you can just go and don't have to worry about this sort of thing. So it is something that's the sort of freedom of the appointed representatives. I can see why that would have been an attractive model. It's
mm,
light touch, it's cheap. You can bring in more money without having to manage people.
yeah,
But that's being regulated now. So these sort of things are, yeah, interesting restrictions. I can
mm,
see exactly why they have to, because maybe things got too far away from being owned, I'm guessing.
yeah. And I think it's sometimes it's one of the things of, it's one of the unintended consequences of regulation in a way, in that the more you regulate something, the more businesses will look for an opportunity to, I suppose, not sort of circumvent the regulation, but operate models that don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money on compliance professionals to help them manage things. So it is something that happens, and you'll see over time how the FCA has sort of plugged these gaps around things because they identify that sort of the unintended consequence or the way that people operate has adjusted to try and take, I suppose, maybe advantage of the situation, but also to
Well, they're
run a business in
businesses.
a way that,
Because
sorry,
they're businesses at the end of the day, so they're going to look to how
yeah,
they can be more profitable and make more money. And these are things
yeah,
that, in theory, are slowing them down.
yeah,
And that's why you need a regulator, of course.
mm,
I
mm,
mean, interesting question. I don't know if you can answer this, but just I'm curious. Does this mean that with these sort of increased regulations from the FCA, so you've got SMCR and you've got consumer duty, and now tightening up on ARs, does that mean there's
mm.
more compliance jobs going? And is it are there more jobs or
I
more
think
information consultants out there?
I can't speak for, in terms of for the whole of the market, but in terms of what I expect is that there's the consumer duty was such a big thing, as was SMCR, that there was a need for, I suppose, a lot of extra resource. And I think you probably saw more of the agencies that need flexible resource looking for people to sort of dive into a business and help them with the consumer duty projects. Um, but in a way, given what the FCA's current agenda is, it ought to be moving back from that a little bit because there is a drive to, I suppose, to reduce the burden of regulation at the moment. And the FCA's messaging, you'll see that in almost everything at the moment is, and we're reducing the burden on firms in terms of regulation by making the rules simpler, more streamlined, trying to reduce the reporting requirements and just taking some things off the edges to try and make it, I suppose, an attractive market for financial services in the UK. I mean, obviously, this is all post-Brexit stuff.
Yeah, okay. Because that's seen as being, I guess, a limit.
Mm.
That is really tricky, though. That's quite a mixed message, isn't it, from the FCA? So you have the regulations coming in with one hand, and the extreme importance of them, and you've got to have the right culture, yet pulling back on the other hand. So it feels quite tricky.
It can,
Really.
yes, yeah, it can. The one thing I would say is that there very rarely are situations where the FCA will create something new that hasn't already existed. So I think that quite a lot of things that you see, like SMCR, like Consumer Duty, are either reiterations or extensions of existing ways in which the FCA has expected people to operate for a long time. So the Consumer Duty principle, number 12, is really an extension of the treating customers fairly principle, which is number 6. So it's always existed. It's just that there is a greater emphasis placed on doing the right thing for customers. But when you take away the whole of the handbook and regulation and the guides, you actually have an organisation which is really concerned with, are firms going to do the right thing in a certain situation? Or how are they going to respond in a situation? And when it comes to maybe enforcement or other action, yes, you'll be starting to look at the handbook and the rules. But actually, the principal way in which we would supervise a business would to make sure that actually they're doing the right thing by their customers.
Okay, and so for me, as a kind of a total novice to this area, the handbook and the rules are what's saying, because you said do the right thing. That's a bit like good, isn't it? But the right thing is defined in the handbook. Is that correct, or?
So no, it isn't, but it isn't defined. But that is the way in which the FCA would operate. And in terms of who decides what doing the right thing is, it isn't ever down to one person to decide that. So, for example, if there's a scenario that presents itself with a business that's being supervised, that particular way of responding is they're considering X, Y, or Z response. That's always discussed internally. So there's always a collective decision around matters to be able to decide actually what do we think is the right thing for them to be doing here.
Okay. So interesting conversation. So focusing in on our conduct and culture and doing the right thing that's been defined by a group of people.
Yeah.
How would I, if I'm in an organisation, and we don't want to make it onerous, but I want to improve the culture or conduct culture in my organisation, where would I start? Maybe give us a couple of examples of what we could do.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think if I just try and set this out into 4 elements, that might just help, because these are the things that I think are really critical to develop and run the right sort of project. So number 1 for me is having the right people on board, and it needs board level sponsorship, together with a good dedicated delivery team, but certainly the right people is critical to start with. Secondly, for me, it'd be about what sort of project you're going to be looking at doing. So there are a number of options here. You can look at maybe a basic framework check. So are our policies and procedure in order? Or secondly, you could have like ensuring the expectation of colleagues in the business are aligned. So do people know what's expected of them? You could also then test a little bit more about, do we follow those expectations? So it's getting a little bit more in depth. Or you could do like a full-blown culture project. And that is the sort of thing that is a detailed, in-depth piece of work to really understand, what the conduct and culture is. So that's the second point, if you like. So in terms of what project you want to do.
Okay. And those are subjects, so you answer the right people and define the project in terms of that. Yep.
Yeah. And then thirdly is obviously project execution. So there's going to be some logical steps in that project that you're going to want to make sure you follow. So that's about 1, how you're going to identify the conduct across the business, and there are methods for doing that. You want to compare that against what your desired conduct and the culture is in the business, if you want to make a change. You need obviously develop an improvement plan, and then you need a strong execution or implementation of that plan as well. So that's in terms of the project. The final thing I would say is critical to this is about engagement throughout. So, good project management, a regular flow of information, strong feedback loop, some sort of governance forum that's operating around it, and continued energy as well. So at the end of the project, you really want to be saying, okay, well, this is great, but actually phase 2 next year is going to focus on this. So those are the four critical aspects, I would say, in terms of doing a project like this.
So I can see how that fits into a kind of classic change curve, almost a change process.
Yeah.
And so if we could go into all of those in lots of detail, but I suppose let's assume the right people, the leadership, that's about sponsorship and ownership and driving the right behaviours and modelling the right behaviours. What I'd be quite interested in is focusing on sections 2 and 3, the sort of practicalities of the things that you might do if you want to, understand what the project is, and then sort of thinking about how you'd execute it.
Yes. Yeah. What would you like to know?
Well, can you give us like a worked example almost, or if you're working with a business and you've obviously don't know the names and you've identified the project, what sort of things might you do if you were working in detail with them, if you were going and running a consultancy session or something?
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I suppose the biggest part for me is actually about identifying conduct across the business. So how are you going to do that? And I think that is the crux of it, because if you can understand what the conduct is across the business at the moment, what the culture is of the business, then you can start to decide what you want to do with it. So, for example, if you do all that piece of work and you realise there's only a little bit of tinkering to do, well, actually, it's a fairly light project you've got, but sometimes it can be a bit more in depth than that. So, in terms of when you are actually trying to identify the conduct, one of the principal things really is about how you're going to engage the people, because you can't do a review of culture really and conduct without speaking to the people. So, you need to make sure that you are going to ensure confidentiality in terms of those who you're speaking with. Make sure that the demographic of those people that you're going to be speaking with are representative of the firm. So, and in what way? So geographical location or role profile, seniority, diversity. So that's important. And I think one of the critical things for me is about how you run the meetings with people to get the most benefit. So
it's more than survey then. You might say it's actually sort of talking to people, sort of focus group or interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that surveys are a really good way of doing that. But in terms of, that would be one of the inputs I would be looking for, on the assumption that the firm does surveys. But in terms of meeting with people, that I've found as the most impactful way of understanding what the culture in the business is, rather than always looking at sort of documentation and survey results. Because if you can get to a point where you're running meetings that you've built safety with people and you've managed to establish some reciprocal trust in there, and they know that there's a purpose in what you're doing, then to me that sort of is the building blocks for successfully getting the information that you want from people, and using obviously a standard type of question set, something that can later be broken down into groupings to identify particular behaviours that are being demonstrated in certain situations.
So if you've got would you have a set of questions? Would you ask the same questions to every organisation, or would you have some based on either the culture you want to explore or suspect? How would you decide the questions?
I think I would imagine that your brief is going to encounter some aspects that the firm is going to want to focus on, probably because they are aware of matters that already exist.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, I would have a standard question set to frame a conversation around, so that there's some consistency there in what you're asking people, because otherwise you can end up in quite a sprawling conversation quite easily, which doesn't really help you at a later stage. But obviously you don't want to stick to it like a robot, because that, again, you want to make sure that you're engaging with people and you get their trust in that environment as well. So yeah, it's got quite a lot of things to think about in there. And that's something that, having worked in the FCA and having worked within a firm, there's different ways of approaching getting the information from people, but always, there has to be that establishment of trust in a meeting, I think, to be able to get the best information from people.
And that is probably going to be best done by a neutral external, I'm assuming. Generally, I mean, maybe HR and D can do things, but you're kind of part of the culture, aren't you? And I presume you've got to allow some kind of anonymity if you start to notice something, for people to kind of give you specific examples. I mean, I guess I'm sort of saying this is in the case of things being less positive type things, where you need to get underneath what's really going on.
Absolutely. I had one classic example several years ago where the firm, somebody asked me to go and have a look at what they consider to be a malfunctioning department in a law firm. And there were a number of assumptions that are being made about individuals and their roles and what they were doing and the sorts of things they were doing wrong. And for me, actually going in and talking to those people, including those who thought that somebody was doing something wrong, those whom it was thought were doing something wrong, you start to unravel what's actually going on. And in that particular situation, it turned out that in particular, there was one individual who was being focused on, and they were considering, can we get rid of this person? It turns out that they were bored in the job. And they weren't challenged and they weren't engaged with by their management. And the management didn't realise this. So,
that means we need to do some classic management, performance management, actually, like have a conversation, set objectives, get to know people's individuals, engagement. So classic. Yeah,
absolutely.
Interesting. So they engage in an entire cultural thing when actually they could have just sorry, that's as someone as a people management person, they could have just done proper people management and might never have got there. It's interesting.
Absolutely. But sometimes having somebody independent in there, it manages to take down those barriers that people are feeling in terms of that their relationship with a certain person might be in a certain way that it's difficult to say something, and having an independent person in there means that everybody's got an opportunity to say, well, I think this guy's right or wrong, and to help reset things.
Sometimes the problem is actually with the person who's perceiving the problem, or they're creating it. So that's a classic thing with, say, a line manager who thinks the problem is with people, but actually that line manager isn't being clear about what's expected, or giving people helpful feedback about what's right, or correcting behaviour in a constructive way. Interesting. Yes, and again, so you've got that neutrality to come in and hold a mirror up and look from objectively.
Yeah.
So you'd go in, you do interviews and really understand what's going on, possibly use survey data. Is there anything else that you would do as part of your sort of cultural audit or exploration?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can take inputs from a number of different places. So we've talked about the people, but I would say secondly, getting hold of the right documentation is critical as well. So things that do help to inform you about the culture that are already there in black and white. So we talked about culture surveys, so they can be very helpful in terms of an input for that. Having access to as wide information as you can. So, looking at board packs and management packs, management information, all sorts of things like conduct risk dashboards, for example, they can provide a useful input for you. So there's a number of different things that you can look at, and a number of different places you can draw on, where the culture is, and look at some of the less I suppose typical ones as well. So what's the actual press profile of the organization, what sort of influence do they get from group if they're part of a wider group. So there's all sorts of different things that can impact on what the culture of that business is.
So I can see how a group would, and the press thing, but so what information, what would be an example of cultural information that you'd gather from a board report or a management report?
So, and sometimes you sort of, it's reading between the lines that you might establish after you've been through a number of board packs. But so, for example, I would look at the extent of debate that there appears to be in the sort of the most senior meetings. Is there a level of challenge that goes on there? Sometimes there's challenge, but it's not recorded. So, it can be actually down to that. But so I've been looking for the information that goes in, how it's discussed between people, the sorts of things that people are focusing on. So I think those are all, really important inputs that you can get. And as I say, sometimes it can tell you things that aren't there, if you like. So as I mentioned, but yeah.
To see how it might be, you see whether it's autocratic and where the power lies and things like that, which have a strong impact on it.
And the makeup of the people that are involved in that. So where from the business do they come? What else are they involved in? So do you have any conflicts in the roles that people are involved in? Sort of being chair of the board and then chairing the risk committee, the remuneration, and the rest of it. Obviously, depending on the size of the business, there sometimes can be no choice. But looking really for who has got influence in that business and how things are really being discussed and decisions made.
So following that through, you've done your cultural assessment. You've got all of these data points. I'm assuming you put together some sort of report or presentation, and you would reflect that back to the board, and they may decide that they want to make some changes. What would be examples of things that people would do, and how would they measure success?
So I think that just in terms of an example of that, so I was looking at one firm where I got hold of some DEI statistics in there, and I started to assess had a look at how that followed through in terms of the business. So how were I suppose different diversity characteristics represented across the business. And in this particular business, it was very male dominated, very white male dominated. And we established that actually something that they could do to improve things is you've got some people in senior positions, or people who were really actually generating change in the business, who needed to have a voice at a senior level. And one example that we had in this particular business was the head of HR, who we thought was a really measured individual, somebody who had got a lot to offer. And they were appointed to the board as a result of the piece of the work that we were doing, and started to instigate change, particularly to address male-female diversity in the business. And they didn't just do it by trying to promote, more involvement within the existing population. They took it right back through to their recruitment policy and how they recruited people and where they recruited people from, and the recruitment process itself, to try and make sure that they were capturing, a wider demographic of people to be able to look at what is the future generation of the business going to be. Yeah.
So that's a really strategic way of shifting things. So were you saying part of that was you identified someone who could make a change and gave them more, you moved them onto the board? They weren't previously part of the board.
That's right. I mean, we didn't move them on, but obviously that was was a recommendation, was that person appeared to be, working very effectively and had enough, had enough presence and had the ear of and respect of some of the other senior people as well. And we thought it was a logical step.
I think that's a really interesting sort of a convergence of, your kind of compliance background, my HR L&D background, because quite often you do see in financial services firms that, and other private sector, a little bit less now, that HR L&D sits maybe as it reports into the FD or legal. And actually, to me, that makes absolutely no sense, because what you meant, so if you look at the top of that firm, there may be no one that's actually about people. They're all about systems and processes, about compliance, they're about numbers, business, which is all fine, but there's no one representing people. And what we're talking about here is culture, and culture is about people. So you need to have that kind of conscience, if you like, and occasionally have that mindset within. But again, that's where I think you're reading between the lines in a board report or something like that, the sort of things that are discussed. That's quite a lot. So my background, and we did have an HR director on the board. This wasn't a financial services company, but you would look at a board agenda, and you'd talk about the numbers first, and then the sales, and the operations, and then last on the agenda for these meetings that always overran would be the people stuff. So that says something about how important it is, and these are things that you can flip if culture is really important. Is there someone thinking about culture at a senior level, and are they somebody who has impact? Because not everybody in an HR role has that kind of strategic impact. Because the example you just talked about there, that is quite a strategic approach. It's the right approach to it, but thinking about it in a bigger picture as a way, just a tactical sticking plaster way. Yes,
exactly. Sort of trying to make the numbers up. If you know what I mean. No, it was a proper serious appointment. And for me, going on from what you were saying, the business is the people, isn't it? And the other way around as well. And without one, you don't have the other. So to me, it's critical.
It seems really obvious when you look at it like that. And also, people have different strengths, and someone who is a fantastic numbers person isn't necessarily going to be a fantastic people person. I'm not saying they'll be rubbish, but they're not necessarily going to have that same strength, and vice versa. So it is about having that kind of diversity of emphasis within an organisation, and that's how you do have that broader culture.
And you see it time and again how bias comes into the selection of people for positions. And
absolutely.
And boards sometimes, think collectively or and some people individually that actually it should follow the way that it's always been, because the firm runs well in the way that it does. And then sometimes that's about fear. fear of not wanting to explore other ways of doing things that could, sort of make a richer way of the firm developing its own culture. So, yeah.
You can definitely see that both ways, can't you? Fear, if you stay the same, you might get left behind because so much is changing, but it depends which mindset it is, of course. I'm conscious of time, Paul, so just wrapping this up, any top tips, if you wanted to summarise, someone out there thinking, not sure what our culture is in terms of conduct and culture, I'd like to do a bit more about this, what would you recommend? Where do they start?
I would start with appetite, really, in terms of, where as a business do we want to be, and what appetite have we got to change things to the way that we want to see them? I think that would be my first thing I would really want to understand is, what's the appetite?
Don't do it for the sake of it. If you're really not bothered, if your heart's not in it, don't even bother.
Absolutely. There's no point in putting a project team together, spending a load of money, and then saying, well, actually, we're quite happy with how it is, thanks. Yeah. So making sure that you've got the right people on board, in terms of whatever project is desired, to follow it through, because I would see these sorts of projects, particularly a culture project, as something that you're not doing just for now. It's something that you're going to repeat, or it's going to be a long-lasting project that's going to go from 1 year to the next. And as the example of things when it doesn't go so well, I've seen culture project work produce a number of different actions that could help the firm to develop, and the firm picked one action out of there that was fairly meaningless to people. Yeah. And a lot of time was invested in that particular project, and as a result of that, engagement in it in future years just dropped, sort of like a small cloud on a sunny day, really. It sort of evaporates, doesn't it?
Compliance, isn't it? It's tick box compliance. It's like engagement surveys, doing engagement survey, ask people what they think, and they tell you, if you kind of don't do anything
about it,
they're not going to carry on telling you. So only be serious about it. I think that's right. Almost less is more in some ways. Do a few things properly, but communicate it and build on it.
Yes. Yeah. So I think sort of being curious. I recommend people to be curious about identifying what their culture really is, to decide how or what they might need to do in order to develop it. But one thing to bear in mind, I think, just thinking about the regulatory side of things, if you do embark on a project, engage with the FCA about it. I would recommend that that's done, and also make sure that you have got a quantitative and qualitative set of results to present to them after it's finished as well. Okay. Because they will want to know whether it's successful or not.
How do you engage with the FCA? Basic question for me. I mean, do you have a kind of a contact, or is there a cultural arm? How do you do that?
So there's no cultural arm of the FCA, but there is a supervision program that is adapted according to the size and impact of firms, basically. So unless something is a strategic market provider that provides a key piece of technology in an industry, which will be supervised, the FCA will engage with them. A lot of it is based on revenue, sort of assets and size, I suppose, ultimately. So some people, the larger firms, will have a relationship management situation. Others will be part of a portfolio that might be a group of firms that operate in a certain sector. So sometimes it can be managed in that way. And then there are other smaller firms as well, those which are managed more by data flags. So that there'll be a group of people that look after the smaller firms, and if there's a flag that's thrown up, then they'll engage with that firm to understand what's going on.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Fascinating, and really enjoyed our conversation. If any of the listeners want to engage with you to talk to you about your services, you do training and you do consultancy in this area, how do they get hold of you?
So we've got a website which is piwconsulting.com. And also, as well as a normal telephone number, I would suggest going through LinkedIn, because that's a good way to reach me. Just search under my name and it should come up from there. And obviously, we'd be happy to talk to anybody who needs any help.
Super. Well, Paul, I'll put all of those in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me on Compliance Culture.
Okay. Thanks, Lucinda.
Thanks so much for joining me today on Compliance Culture. I hope you found our discussion was practical and insightful, and helps us to see how we can all play a part in embedding genuine values-led compliance. If you'd like to know more about how Actus software can support organisations with performance accountability, consumer duty and SMCR compliance, why don't you visit us on actus.co.uk? The links are in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and share the podcast, and join me next time as we continue to explore what real compliance culture looks like in action.
Tracking consumer duty metrics manually can be time-consuming and inconsistent. Spreadsheets quickly become outdated, and it's hard to evidence progress when data lives in multiple places. Actus Oversight takes this pain away, bringing all your consumer duty metrics, actions, and ownership into one intuitive platform. With real-time dashboards and audit-ready reporting, you'll save time, stay in control, and have complete confidence in your compliance story.
Why don't you visit us on actus.co.uk?